afternoon. My name is Jason Ruiz. I teach American Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and I will serve as the chair and moderator for this panel, which, apropos to this year's conference theme, explores the miseries of marriage. Already? Wow. And appropriately miserably, we will ask, what is lost when queers win marital rights? I'm particularly pleased that the eminent scholars assembled for this panel have agreed to share with us their thoughts on this timely issue of marriage politics, now that we are 4 months removed from Obergefell and Hodge's decision. As most, well, probably all of you know, the process of putting together a conference like this one takes many months, and applicants must describe their intentions of what they plan to discuss way back in January. I know some of you can relate. Back in January, we had a sense that the Supreme Court would make a ruling, of course, and before our October meeting, and most of us guessed how it would land. Most of us guessed, of course, that it would rule same-sex marriage constitutional. But although it might appear that the matter is closed, there is, of course, much to discuss and reassess a few months later about what happens next now that marriage is the law of the land in the United States, despite the best efforts of certain county clerks. Instead of informing papers, I asked the panelists today to prepare just some very brief opening remarks before we open up to a bigger discussion. And I hope that they might have a discussion with each other first, that we will then open up to all of you beautiful people. The panelists on the stage have identified with each other and with me a wide range of topics that they hope to touch on this afternoon. They range from issues like voting rights, monogamy, violence, to the ways in which bisexual and trans identity formations might offer new challenges to homonormative marriage politics. This is to say that we have a lot of ground to cover in 105 minutes. So instead of making long and fancy introductions, and in the spirit of the discussion format, always encouraged by ASA, I will keep them completely minimalist, saying only each panelist's institutional affiliation, with the hope that you will forgive me for not doing justice whatsoever to their many accomplishments. So I'll go in order of the program, and that will be the order in which they will speak this afternoon. So Juana Rodriguez is professor in the Gender and Women's Studies Department at UC Berkeley, where she is also affiliated with the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, the Berkeley Center for New Media, the Center for Race and Gender, and the Center for the Study of Sexual Cultures. Chandan Reddy is Associate Professor of English at the University of Washington. Kevin P. Murphy is the Chair of the Department of American Studies and Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota. Lisa Duggan is Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. Chantal Nadeau is Professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Che Gossett is on the program, but unfortunately could not be with us today and sends their regrets. Susan Stryker is Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies, as well as the Director of the Institute for LGBT Studies at the University of Arizona. I want to really thank them for being here today. As a member of the program committee, this was a dream to put together a panel like this to discuss such a timely topic. So really, I do thank you for making the time to be here today, and to all of you for coming. They've agreed to keep their opening remarks to just about 10 minutes so that we can have plenty of time for discussion, which I know some of you are eager to engage in. And we will start with Juana. Thank you.
Jason did so much work on this, so thank you so much, Jason. For my brief comments today, I want to start with a discussion of methodology. As a scholar of queer Latinidad, the archives I have felt most attracted to have been narratives, images, and performances. Scholarly objects brimming with fleshy frictions and perverse interpretive possibilities. More recently, however, I have added a new object of scholarly desire into my polyamorous harem of intellectual playthings, one that I'm still unsure about, a methodological toy that I only use on occasion, but which offers very particular possibilities and delights. Statistics. In 2011, the Williams Institute published a report entitled, "How Many People Are Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender?" In it, they compiled information from 9 different surveys, 5 of which were based in the United States and the remaining from Europe and Canada. While the specific numbers varied, one element remained relatively consistent across all survey instruments. Self-identified bisexuals outnumber lesbians and gays, turns out roughly 52% of LGB is B. And over 40% of those that self-identify as bisexual also identify as people of color. Even as I remain skeptical of how statistics are derived and deployed, data makes visible certain figures and forms that discourse analysis alone has trouble seeing. So specifically today, I want to consider how the unrecognized and unrespectable status of bisexuality makes marriage and the monogamous monosexual sexuality upon which it is predicated all the more miserable. Organizations like BiNet that promote bi-visibility are, of course, quick to point out that bisexuals are, sadly, not doing everyone simultaneously all the time. We too can be monogamous and married. But that's not really the point. The point about marriage is that you only get to choose one, and that choice always runs counter to the pansexual desires that bisexuality calls into being. Like other sexual identities, bisexuality remains enmeshed within race and class associations of the down low, viewed as the apolitical option for those too closeted or too backward to fully affirm a gay or lesbian identity, or a sign of immaturity that one will eventually outgrow. Similarly, when practiced by racialized others, socially sanctioned forms of non-monogamy become a sign of misogyny and cultural primitivism, evidence of sexual deviance and degeneracy. It seems polyamory, like bisexuality, is socially valued as modern and progressive only when it's aligned with the norms of neoliberal whiteness. In activist circles, bisexuals are often imagined to be able to enjoy the material and social benefits of heterosexuality at their whim. Again, turning to statistics helps us tell a different story. For both men and women, bisexuals have higher rates of poverty than either heterosexuals or gays and lesbians, with bisexual women having the highest rates of poverty at 29%. And you can imagine these statistics as they might be filtered, further differentiated by race, for example. For suicidality, the outcomes are repeated. While gay men and lesbians have rates of 25 and 35% respectively, 45% of bisexual women have considered or attempted suicide. In fact, study after study show that the life chances of bisexuals relative to income, health, and violence, particularly bisexual women, are more precarious than either heterosexual men or women or gays and lesbians. In a moment when gay and lesbian identities are increasingly receiving various forms of state recognition, including marriage, bisexuality unsettles attempts to make queerness respectable within the binary logics of hetero or homo normativity. Because while bisexuality also refers to romantic inclinations, it remains discursively attached to unruly, decidedly not respectable sexual desires that are imagined as not sustainable within the parameters of hetero or homo-monogamous marriage. Given its statistical significance, remember, this is over half of LGBT community, the invisibility of bisexuality within both popular and academic discourse is more than curious. It serves to reveal what is being hidden behind the erasure of bisexuality as a category of analysis. Legal scholar Kenji Yoshino argues that both hets and homos have overlapping interests in what he terms, quote, an epistemic contract of bisexual erasure. He describes these interests as 1, the retention of sex as an important diacritical axis, 2, the protection of forms of monogamy, and 3, the stabilization of exclusive sexual orientation categories that I would add are predicated on stable gender categories. In fact, like transgender identity, bisexuality does not easily fit into the queer theoretical rubrics we might use to think about something like marriage. Furthermore, as definable gender categories start to become undone through the critical lens that transgender studies offers, our understandings of desire and sexuality in relation to categories of lesbian and gay also get productively unhinged. Politically and theoretically, bisexual and transgender identity also share nuanced and complicated relationships to temporal narratives that attempt to fix the time of gender or of sexual self-knowing. And both transgender and bisexual people are frequently called out for supposedly undermining the political projects of queerness, either by reinscribing fixed understandings of a gender binary that queer is intent on questioning, or by passing into legible social categories of privilege. However, rather than reify categories of gender, both the B and the T generally decenter attention to genitals as determinants of gender identity or sexuality. And rarely are gays or lesbians called out for their attachments to men or women as supposedly stable categories. And of course, all sorts of people try to pass or fail to pass into and out of categories of privilege or marginalization. We also know that passing as a Black man or as a Latina woman rarely comes with social bennies. The statistical data around bisexuals reveals that passing or refusing to pass has dire psychic and social consequences. Perhaps the resistance to more fully integrating the complexities of bisexuality into our scholarship and our politics is more aptly explained by Claire Hemmings, who asserts that, quote, bisexuality continues to be invisible because that invisibility is fundamental to ensuring that lesbians and gay men remain the de facto subjects of queer studies. Decentering gay and lesbian means getting way more specific about what behaviors, communities, kinship patterns, and identities get subsumed under the banner of queer. It means being much more explicit about what, who, and why we do what we do sexually as a way of investigating how sex functions as a regulatory force. Coming out as a sex worker, as asexual, as kinky, as trans, as bi might all be understood as queer, yet each exists within different proximities to violence and marginalization, making us legible and illegible not only as potential marriage partners, but as potential subjects of national citizenship. Perhaps what we lose when we win is the memory of all those other ways of being queer, of being illegitimate and undocumented freaks under attack, and the solidarity of what it might mean to be queer differently together. Thank you.
I can do it from here? Oh, I can come up, that's okay.
Thanks, so many people here. So let me give a bit of the punchline because I'm probably not going to get through everything, and we can talk about it further during Q&A. I've been thinking for a while now about why it is that gay marriage has moved so swiftly and so easily through the state form, particularly a state that was officially heterosexual in its constitution, if we remember Margot Canada's formulation in the early 20th century, and how to make sense of, in other words, upon what waves of transformation is it attached that it was able to make this kind of remarkable, successful transformation. Think about any other social movement of difference, race, gender, etc. The duration for any forms of state victory and state incorporation have been at least 3 or 4 times as long. And what I would say is that what it has picked up is what I would say a transformation of the state after the era of civil rights into an administrative state. And gay marriage has been the recoding or the displacement of constitutional rights into administrative rights, where administration is now also the locus for the control of the racialized poor. And I can talk to you more about that in the Q&A. All right. I understand marriage equality as naming the specifically U.S. legal institutional movement that sought state and federal marriage contracts with their associated rights and recognitions for same-sex couples that otherwise already possess legal standing with the state, such as U.S. citizens and some permanent residents. Indeed, though same-sex marriage is legal in 22 countries, it has not always been understood in terms of marriage equality, nor achieved legal movement and juridical power. For example, in post-colonial Ireland, it was won through popular referendum rather than litigation, which I think Lisa's going to talk about. And in Anne Mulholland's piece on Bully's Lawyer, she does an elegant job of arguing that, in fact, marriage passed there as a critique of austerity. And austerity was the mechanism that joined both immigrants and working class populations, whereas we understand marriage as part of the process of austerity and neoliberalism. All right, so importantly, nowhere else used or appropriated a modern constitutional amendment for the abolition of slavery, in this case the 14th Amendment and equal protection, to make their claim to and for state power and recognition. However, before I delve into this new form of power that I'm interested in talking about, that the legal victory of marriage equality, marriage is a part of, and sanctions and dangerously expands, I want to first note the limits of thinking queer politics, or even a variety of anti-racist and radical politics through a critical focus on marriage, whether we think of marriage as happy or miserable. Dean Spade and Craig Wilsey articulate concisely the violent ruse of the gay marriage institutional movement. Quote, same-sex marriage advocacy has accomplished an amazing feat. It has made being anti-homophobic synonymous with being pro-marriage, end quote. In doing so, it has restricted anti-homophobic critique as well, I would argue, to national ways of knowing, restricting the horizon and meaning of queer social and cultural acts to those that interpolate us as subjects of national historical time, at the very moment in which cultural politics and activism has revealed the post-national social forces and economic order that determine national experiences and nation-based lives, particularly in the global north. So even as we think about a critical relation to this moment of marriage equality, we ought not to presume that we know already the time in which we are currently working and thinking. Indeed, marriage equality already institutes us into a temporality and historical time that privileges those subjects, objects, and epistemologies that naturalize the nation-state as a rational development of a globally universal historical time. To pre-critically orient our concerns about the politics of race, gender, and sexuality by joining in the national public orgy over the legalization of gay marriage earlier this summer, we have to remind ourselves that thinking about the racial and gendered and sexual politics of social difference through a focus on gay marriage operates as well as a disavowal of what we don't know of other polities globally and of the transnational conditions constitutive but otherwise obscured by national historical time. It, in other words, forecloses a reckoning with how the privileging of marriage and its institutional epistemologies are also the conditions for our knowing and unknowing of the very geographies, peoples, histories within which queer theory pursues its critiques of modern sexuality. So just to be concrete, if you think about queer studies, this was before marriage. We were in a moment in queer studies in which critiques of diaspora, in which critiques of non-Western modalities of thinking sexual politics that can't be understood through the figuration of queer were all emergent in our field. Now if you look at this panel, we're all sort of subdued to talk about marriage. And so I just want to mark the work of things such as Queer Diaspora by Gayatri Gopinath and others that this elision is participating in. To engage with those cultural formations and subjects that are felicitously abandoned, such as diasporas, or cannot be known, such as indigenous groups, through mere inclusion or exclusion from these foundations and epistemologies, will require, in fact, a displacement of our inquiry of marriage, even the one that I'm going to try to focus on today. So I want to focus my comments within a simultaneous call for a more expansive curiosity about the constitutive geographies, peoples, and contingent histories and formations that we don't know as queer studies if we take up the marriage mantle. All right, now to marriage. Marriage equality was widely celebrated and understood, even among its critics, as a fait accompli after the Supreme Court decisions in two cases, U.S. v. Windsor and Hollingsworth v. Perry, both of which were read on June 28, 2013. Within 2 days of that decision, on June 30th, the same court struck down the civil rights landmark Voting Rights Act in Shelby County v. Holder. Those celebrating marriage equality could do little more than decry the injustice of the latter decision, seeing it as a declension of the very ethos, claims, and values that enabled the marriage victory. And even Obama said, "I'm very happy about marriage and very disappointed about voting rights," as if these were similar kinds of cases, and both used the 14th Amendment and due process, and so one was a victory and one was somehow a loss. Yet clearly, gutting voting protections for African Americans and other people of color and other disenfranchised poor communities of color on the heels of the federal recognition of gay marriage demands a more complex and historical appraisal. Rather, as I hope to show, marriage equality is in fact absolutely compatible with the destruction of Black and brown voting rights. Elsewhere, I have argued that despite the widespread analogizing of the legalization of gay marriage to the striking down of US anti-miscegenation laws in Loving v. Virginia, that case does not so much mark the end of anti-miscegenation or the racial organization of US kinship, nor does it mark the rise of some kind of neoconservative ideology of colorblindness and love. Rather, as we know, Loving indexes and mediates the shifts in racial meanings conducted through a juridical discourse on interracial intimacy as the post-war US state moved from being officially white supremacist to a racial liberal state. Now, it's important to recall or remind ourselves that Loving is significant for a number of reasons, one of which it is the only civil rights case, as well as the only case of the Supreme Court, in which the court explicitly uses the words white supremacy to define its previous historical practice. And so it finds itself in that moment in a unique condition, which is how does a white supremacist state have the authority to invalidate itself on white supremacy? And right, and so what it argues is that the way that it can invalidate white supremacy, and this is what I mean by the transition to a racially liberal state, is that it takes recourse to the concept of marriage as a natural right or as a fundamental right. And it argues that because marriage is a fundamental right, it has to extinguish the rights of the white supremacist state and institute the order of racial liberalism. Right? And it's that language of fundamental right that has organized the gay marriage movement, right? And so you need to know where it came from and what the purpose of, which was the transformation of white supremacy into racial liberalism. So racial liberalism in this era sought to demobilize, suppress, and control autonomous Black social movements as integral to the sublation of white supremacy in the new post-war racial liberal order, relying heavily on juridical institutions and discourses to control the meaning of race and the understanding of equality within racial capitalism. Importantly, many of the social movements in the 50s were among Black women organizations talking about sexual violence and sexual rape, and none of that is in the discussion, of course, of Loving v. Virginia. Marriage equality inherits this social order, in other words, the epistemes of intimacy, identity, and individual rights that developed within and structurally reproduced this order, using the very legal savoirs and logics now of fundamental rights, for example, that actually continue to obscure and displace from political legitimacy and our contemporary understanding the variety of autonomous Black social movements that were developed in this period. Autonomous Black struggles constitute, in other words, for me, a different possible fulcrum by which we might understand and work out a post-war, formerly anti-white supremacist American epoch. That is, the very rubrics and terms through which queer intimacies now gain legal and cultural recognition as marriages emerge from and re-articulate those earlier racial liberal orders and forms of state, ones that relied heavily on juridical institutions and their modes of knowing. Against an understanding of a break from white supremacy, racial liberalism and racial liberal state have been key to the continuation of the racially asymmetrical relations, modes of productions, and distribution of history and meaning of the previous white supremacist epoch. The rubrics, logics, and terms that we inherit now from that era of racial liberalism, now to legally affirm and mark juridically legible queer intimacies, are also at once then the epistemic mechanisms that persistently devalue and look suspiciously upon Black social struggles and autonomous cultural formations and worlds as a different fulcrum of our historical moment. Perhaps this is why we should appraise, can I get some water? Sorry. Perhaps this is why we should appraise the entrenchment of racial despotism and racially despotic state power as always already an imminent possibility within the legal movement for gay marriage, one contingently realized now in the Supreme Court decisions of these three cases. Two that at once affirmed gay marriage equality, while simultaneously in the other negating the law of Black political voice through the destruction of voting rights. In other words, to think queer theory after gay marriage is at once to demand that we think queer theory after the loss of Black voting rights, a loss all the more vivid in this politicized moment against the state-sanctioned killing of Black and brown peoples. And current women of color and queer of color organizing, a crucial origin and feature of the Black Lives Matter movement, is the source then of a different queer of color critique that pauses and works through the historical and epistemological conditions by which the construction of a gay right to marriage is embedded within, activates, and transmits the rationalities and social reality that cast Blackness as always already in violation of the national law and right, a violence to be suspected. In doing so, queer of color critique can desubjugate the histories of Black struggles and cultural lives now made unknowable or meaningless by racial liberalism and the rationalities of the national state, unsettling the immediacy of the present to ourselves. By surfacing the constructedness and the thick racial violence of abstract juridical notions such as a fundamental right to marriage that seek to organize and limit our understanding both of racial liberalism upon which we inherit and our own moment. These movements direct our attention to the past and persistent Black social worlds of protest, intimacy, and pleasure and survival that the law has obscured and forecloses from our knowing through its anti-miscegenation rulings and now through gay marriage, in order to ask if the attainment of legal rights to homosexual marriage at this moment occurs only in and through the persistence of this foreclosure of Black law or Black right as a contingent fulcrum. In doing so, we can orient our political and ethical and critical attentions to the racialized queerness that we still do not know or are yet to desire as one of our own. And I'll just end by saying that, in other words, you could also think about the ways in which the Black Lives Matter is precisely a movement that emerged because of the development of gay marriage. Thank you.
So I've been instructed by our moderator to tell people in the back that there are plenty of seats up front, if you care to take them.
Now, of course, it's nice to look at the people standing in the back.
So on Friday, June 26th of this year, as Pride Weekend festivities, and it seems to be going from sort of Pride Day to weekend to week, we're getting underway in New York and other cities across the country. Nikki Wolf, a reporter for the U.S. edition of The Guardian, published a story under the headline, quote, "It was all worth fighting for. Stonewall revels in U.S. gay marriage victory." Like other reporters, Wolf went to the Stonewall Inn in the West Village to report on the Supreme Court Obergefell versus Hodges marriage ruling and to record the reactions of patrons. Her article demonstrates many of the elements common to much of mainstream media's reporting on the marriage ruling. For example, it overstates the place of the Stonewall Rebellion of 1969 in the larger history of LGBT rights movements. Woolf wrote, for example, of that event, "This was their stand. Thousands took to the streets for days of unrest. Scores were arrested. Stonewall galvanized the community. From here, the movement was truly born," end quote. Woolf continued by positioning same-sex marriage as the culmination of what she called the movement, declaring, "On Friday, America's highest court ruled in favor of gay marriage in every state. The arc of the moral universe, the rainbow arc, which began here almost 5 decades ago, had finally curved toward justice." So, and through interviews with revelers, the piece then portrays the legalization of same-sex marriage as a liberatory event. One interview was quoted as saying, "It's the gift of freedom. It was all worth fighting for." This article, of course, was no anomaly. Other reporting worked even harder to collapse the longer history of same-sex sexuality and historical struggles for sexual and gender liberation and rights for queer people into a linear, progressive narrative culminating in marriage equality. Just a day later, NBC News, in a piece entitled "The Long March to Marriage Equality from Stonewall to the Supreme Court," published a timeline that included an array of disparate events, including the emergence of HIV/AIDS, Ellen DeGeneres' "Yep, I'm Gay" Time magazine cover story, Matthew Shepard's murder, and the Lawrence versus Texas sodomy decision in its triumphalist narrative of the march to gay marriage. As many others, including those on this panel, have argued, this popularized progressive vision of history includes all kinds of elisions and distortions. It ignores and marginalizes the interests the interests of a whole range of actors, including non-white and gender non-conforming people, erases long-standing queer and feminist critiques of marriage as violent, oppressive, and patriarchal, and misrepresents state recognition as the shared central goal of activism that stretches over half a century. So to respond to the question that frames this session, what do queers lose when we win the marriage movement? The ubiquity of narratives that read history backwards to celebrate same-sex marriage demonstrates with great clarity that we lose, or at least threatened with losing, a complex understanding of queer intersectional past that includes struggles for economic justice and sharply honed critiques of normative structures of oppression, structures that, of course, include marriage itself. They obviate a main tenet of radical liberationist ideology that position marriage as the most miserable institution enforcing rigid regimes of gender and sexual normativity. There's certainly no room in this vision of history for the critique proffered by Carl Whitman in his 1970 Gay Manifesto that, quote, "Traditional marriage is a rotten, oppressive institution. To accept that happiness comes through finding a groovy spouse and settling down, showing the world that we are just the same as you, is avoiding the real issue and is an expression of self-hatred." Indeed, this well-developed critique of marriage that focused on the institution's role in sustaining systematic oppression and producing personal misery, especially for women and others who could not claim substantial economic or cultural resources, was nowhere to be found in Justice Kennedy's majority opinion, in spite of the fact that Kennedy had access to complex and nuanced histories of marriage by major scholars. In the most offensive part of that opinion, one that I should note was perversely characterized as, quote, "the most powerful defense of the rights of same-sex couples in the New Republic," Kennedy wrote that, quote, "no union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family." And then continued by claiming of same-sex marriage petitioners that, quote, "their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law." As Michael Cobb, in a really fantastic editorial, wrote, Kennedy's opinion, or argued, Kennedy's opinion equated marriage with dignity, thereby positioning those who organize their lives and loves in other ways as losers, undeserving of the benefits of the recognition of the state. The opinion then leverages same-sex marriage in order to make the condition of singlehood an abject one. What we have then is now a dominant historical narrative in which marriage becomes the glorified end to decades of social struggle and activism, and through which normative married couples become firmly entrenched in the charm circle, and those disinclined to marry are further stigmatized and denied access to rights and benefits. At the same time, marriage becomes the lens through which multiple and complicated queer histories are interpreted. This is no accident, of course, and is not solely the production of Supreme Court justices and mainstream reporters. The campaign for marriage equality led by HRC and other gay rights groups made the case for marriage based on claims of normative status for lesbian and gay individuals and by equating marriage with dignity and citizenship. The impact of that version of history has become abundantly clear, and including in recent popular queer history in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, where I live and work, and it's a topic I pay attention to and have written about in the collaborative public history Queer Twin Cities. Local LGBT community leaders and public historians have rushed to tie a history that involves significant radical protest and intersectional campaigns for economic justice and anti-violence projects to the success of the marriage movement. And I should really just say it's local lesbian and gay community leaders who label themselves LGBT. I'd like to close by offering one such example. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the Twin Cities saw a wave of murders of gay men and trans women, which sparked widespread activism aimed at police collusion with this violence and police brutality against gay, lesbian, and trans people. These activities also connected these acts of violence to punitive and discriminatory governmental responses to the AIDS crisis and to increased surveillance and harassment in gay bars and public cruising sites. Renee Esparza, a PhD candidate in American Studies at the University of Minnesota, is completing a fascinating dissertation that, in part, not only examines these episodes of violence and activist responses to them, but also looks at the collusion of some elected lesbian and gay local officials in using this violence as an opportunity to surveil and police gay public sex and sex work within the metropolitan area. So the past several months, riding on the wave of this sort of marriage euphoria, there have been several renewed attempts to memorialize those who were murdered during this period, including the installation and dedication of a bench in the memory of Joel Larson, a 22-year-old gay man who was killed as he cruised in Warren Park, a popular cruising site in a gay neighborhood in Minneapolis. By all accounts, Larson was a vocal queer presence in the bar scene in the Twin Cities, a supporter of HIV/AIDS activism, and a critic of assimilationist and normative projects. While many of his friends celebrated those aspects of his legacy, the official memorial efforts have strenuously tethered his life to a story of gay progress in Minnesota, which views and legitimates, which they believe is viewed and legitimated by the successful same-sex marriage referendum in 2013 and the recent Supreme Court decision. So a gay state senator who spoke at the bench dedication, for example, declared that the legalization of same-sex marriage demonstrates just how far the state has come in moving beyond the kind of violence that Larson's and others experienced decades ago. And it uses the positive vote in the statewide referendum to support that. Missing from this and other similar episodes of memorialization was attention to ongoing and horrific violence aimed especially at trans women of color, including the attack against C.C. McDonald just a few years earlier. So one of the outcomes of the concerted campaign for marriage equality that has relied so heavily on narratives of normative belonging is to cement an egregiously teleological queer history that renders violence and oppression as disappearing on the horizon, thereby eliding an activist and radical past and averting attention from violence and oppression in the present. Thank you.
So I do have a lot of misery about the whole marriage thing. I really call it more more a kind of bitterness. And it's not solely because my supplementary campaign for same-sex adultery, bigamy, golden was sidelined, or because of my annoyance at the whole idea of same-sex. First, no girlfriend I have ever had has actually been same sex. And then there's like, well, after a few months, it's really the same sex for everybody. There. But what I really wanted to talk about today is to intervene from the standpoint of American Studies scholarship in the public domain framing of the debate over marriage as being between pragmatic people who are engaged in populist enterprise and improving people's lives versus radical utopian ultra-leftists who have fantasies that really have nothing to do with how people actually live. That appears not only in the mainstream press, but I don't know if any of you read Jacobin, for instance, which is a really very good left, e-journal that, but they print almost nothing on feminism or queer issues, but they do one on gay marriage, and they do exactly that framing of the practical and populist marriage campaigns that they as leftists support versus the ultra-left radical utopians, queers who are against it. So in order to intervene in that, I want to really turn to historically situated American scholarship and do a little framing to interrupt that. Because actually the conversation about marriage is that there is no such thing as marriage, right, as a singular institution. It's a historically situated set of practices having to do with households, partnerships, and reproduction. And the analysis of it has to really attend to the specific role that those practices and institutions play in relation to organized religions and states, and how those are shaped by and influence the history of empire and racial capitalism. And that's really the issue about when we're trying to have a critical analysis of marriage. It's not about you people who get married are boring compared to me because I'm glamorous and cool. And really because, given that those are the institutions we have, there are a lot of good reasons to be married. And I may actually be the only person on this panel who has been married. Oh, you have too. Far out. But there are a lot of reasons to get married. It's not a critique of people who marry as not being radical enough, which is the way it's often interpreted. Given that that's what the choices are, of course there are all kinds of reasons, economic and immigration, many reasons for that. It's not about that, but it is about a kind of situating of these practices and doing an analysis of that has been long-standing in American studies scholarship. For instance, scholarship on settler colonialism, which is very clearly analyzes the role that the imposition of European Christian marriage on indigenous populations plays, and how that form of marriage, supplanting other kinds of partnership, household, and reproductive arrangements, is core to the overall project of domination. So thinking about it in that way, or there's a really wonderful book that really makes a great teaching book by Eileen Suarez-Fendley called Imposing Decency. It's about the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and about the U.S. in trying to impose legal marriage on a population that was very resistant to that, where common law, so-called common law practices were what were the widespread practice, and the U.S. state had reasons to want to impose legal marriage. Forms of legal marriage. Catherine Franke, a law professor, has a book coming out soon on the complex imposition of legal marriage practices on African Americans in the period of Reconstruction, and really looks at how, that the narrative of rushing to marry was not really what happened. It was a very complicated set of legal and cultural a project there to impose a particular form of legal, state-recognized marriage. Nyan Shah's book, which I think I teach this every year, Contagious Divides, which is a history of Chinatown in San Francisco, which analyzes the way that in order to fight the racism that took the form of saying Chinese people were dirty, that the kind of uplift politics that imposed domesticity and a form of marriage, that the way that worked to marginalize bachelor societies and sex workers. And Shaw makes a very direct argument at the end of that book that in the wake of the AIDS pandemic, that the movement towards marriage politics in the U.S. gay community was actually had some similarities to that campaign in Chinatown, the sort of uplift politics to counter a kind of virulent, in this case homophobia, in that case racism. So we have a lot of scholarship that actually looks at marriage as not one thing, but actually a set of very contested practices embedded in empire and capitalism. But in the present as well, though, we also need to look at marriage campaigns to see their particular political context and effects. In high benefit, high wage states and contexts, marriage itself has a very different and more limited importance than it does in low wage, low benefit states, where marriage is a conduit along with employment for all kinds of benefits. It becomes, in the case of the United States, which is, king of the low wage, low benefit economies, it becomes a privatizing institution, right? In this context, it's all of a piece with privatizing social welfare. That's not necessarily true in other contexts. And actually, Macarena Gomez-Ferris and I had a conversation a number of years ago on a panel where, Maca, you were talking about Latin America and how campaigns for same-sex marriage there had such a different valence because they were not in low wage, they were not in, cowboy neoliberal states. So they had like a different valence. So again, marriage is not, the idea of marriage and its effects are not the same in different political economies. And the way I want to make that point here is, though I've certainly been one of the ones to argue vociferously that marriage is part of a neoliberal, privatizing campaign in the United States. I think that's true. But we published in our little blog, Bully Bloggers, which was recently called on a Facebook thread, the new Pravda, which I thought was kind of fabulous. But we published the piece that Chandan mentioned by Anne Mulhall, who wrote on the Irish context, on the Irish referendum in the spring. So unlike a legal case, the referendum there, the referendum campaign had all the same kind of really odious tropes of prosperous white gay people, no bis, no trans, no freaks, right? It was a very well-controlled PR campaign, very similar to the one here. But because it was a referendum, and because it was in the context of an Irish state that's controlled so much by the church, it had a very different valence. So I'm just going to read a summary from the beginning of this as an example of how different the context can be for thinking about this thing. I mean, Anne sent me an email at some point and said, it's not the same here. What you say in the US, it just doesn't work here. And so we said, okay, right? Okay. So she said, the importance of the political mobilization of working class communities in Dublin in the process of building a self-organized and powerful anti-austerity movement cannot be overstated. And this was a decisive factor in the marriage referendum passing. Voters in Jobstown and young immigrants coming, quote, home to vote were not voting in solidarity with the government and the state, but in defense of the multiple impoverishments and oppressions that the state has enacted on the majority of those who live here. The political and relational texture and hopefulness of these and other mobilizations, disruptions, acts of citizenship against the state produced in excess of the managed marriage campaign are occluded when the Irish marriage referendum is viewed solely through the lens of the established radical queer critique. And it's a very long piece and it's extremely well done and I recommend it. It's called The Republic of Love and it's on Bully Bloggers. And whether you agree with it or not, there's certainly room to have a hackle with the argument she's making. I think that it beautifully establishes that, marriage as a multiple institution of political economy as well as of culture is not the same thing, and we can't really take our own context and try to generalize or externalize it, and we have to understand it as embedded in the conflicts of empire and capitalism, of austerity and neoliberalism, of at different historical moments, rather than being the battle between the pragmatic populists and the radical utopian ultra-leftists. I'm not ashamed of that.
Thank you, Jason, for organizing this session. I want to say a couple of things before I get into my remarks. First thing is, actually, it's kind of ironic we have this conversation today as we are in Ontario. And Ontario was the first state legislation to legalize same-sex marriage in 2003, and before it became like at the national level in 2005. The second
Chantal, could you get closer to the mic? Could you?
Comme ça?
Yes.
And the second thing I want to say is I will have the shortest, and I hope you can notice the irony, I will have the shortest intervention, and for a French you did something. So I decided today I will share with you basically my subconscious, and so basically instead of going to therapy, I decided to be with you and share some of those things. And I'm glad you're laughing because this is the only part that's very funny. The other things I wanted to say, one of the impetus or the framework for my intervention today is something that we have not necessarily discussed so far, but I'm sure that's been lingering. The way that marriage equality and the battle for marriage equality has been presented, Chandan mentioned, about fundamental rights, but more specifically about human rights as a basic human right. So I'm gonna torture you with the human today. So I call my little spin queer theory itch. So I want to frame my remarks today with the following question, and then I can this is after that question you have out to deframe on Facebook. What if we need marriage? What if queer theory needs marriage? Over the past years, like so many other queer theorists, I've spent a lot of time and energy putting myself against marriage. Brilliant critics of gay marriage have been made, and a lot of people are here and also in the audience, and to dissect and denounce the heteronormative and homonormative politics of marriage equality. Yet, as we you know too well right now, we lost the battle, and marriage is not legal. So in light of this, I pose the question again: what if we need marriage? More particularly, how can we use the arrival of marriage equality to reorient queer theory? Today, I offer two ways to think about marriage and queer theory. First, it calls on us to rethink the relationship between political principle and pragmatism, and Lisa just hint on that in her intervention. So it's about this old age tango between theory and practice. Second, it calls on us to reconsider the relationship of queerness and queer to the human. This conversation has been going for the past few years in queer theory, but I will pass on that and maybe open that in the Q&A. So to elucidate my points, I want to reconsider the normative spaces occupied by queers. Queer theorists tend to portray queers as on the margin of society and possibly non-human. Maybe not on those terms, but it's always some kind of lingering thing going on there. So what I would like to do is suggest instead that queers have been situated at the very center and foundation of a national self-conception. So, and in a very funny way, the past month I've been really returning to Mary Matsuda's work and Roberto Esposito's work on immunity. So I'm gonna if you spare with me, I'm gonna share those little moments of subconscious with you. So Matsuda uses the term outsiders within to designate the forms of consciousness that outsiders develop in the social and political domains where they are denied full inclusion. What is interesting in Matsuda's analysis is her insight that exclusion is not necessarily marginalization, but rather an exclusionary inclusion, a form of belonging that sets those so designated apart. I want to suggest that this has been the spatial orientation of queers. In this schema, it is not that queers are outside the norms through which a community constitutes itself. Rather, queers are incorporated in a manner that accepts them, that particularize them and mark them in ways that reconfirm heterosexual affiliation as the organizing principle of the polity. So the legalization of marriage for same-sex couples, for me, completely destabilized the status of queers as outsiders within. The advent of marriage equality makes queers simply insiders, and I use queer in a very loose, sloppy way, and I would probably fail my grad students to use the but for the point of that. Okay. So what the Scottish decision of June 2015 highlights is that the right to marry is guided not so much by liberal values as dignity or equality, but rather by a belief that the petitioners are in need of protection. In writing the majority opinion, Justice Kennedy constantly reminds us that the petitioners experience injuries and other forms of harm, both material and affective, by being denied the right to marry. As the ruling maintains, the necessary protection is only possible by the incorporation of the petitioners into the Marriage Act. So here where I come with my 2 points. First, by now, we are all familiar with the critiques of marriage that focus on the fact that gender, racial, and class injustice and inequality are endemic to the institution. Our critiques, while cogent, have been underwritten by a belief in the possibility of politics without remainders. And yet, we all know some radical queer or two who have taken advantage of the right to marry for particular protections it offers. We could call it mariage à la carte. The queers among us marry for health coverage, immigration, custody protection, job protections, inheritance rights, and so forth. In short, they take advantage of the protections of an institution at the expense of others, and that we can, extensively discuss that. So again, I'm still stuck on the idea that how can we reconcile the principled political arguments we have made and want to make with the practical, pragmatic questions of how queers might access protections that they quite clearly need in their daily lives. Can a model of queer theory oriented around questions of norms and normativity still help us understand the ramification of marriage equality? And I know there was a huge brouhaha on public levels about that. So this brings me to my second question. If queers need to access the protections of marriage in their daily lives, if these protections make their lives more livable, more habitable, then how can queer theory accommodate their desire to take up the mantle of the human? In queer theory, we often rehearse the idea that society at large refused the humanity of queers as if queer constitutes a category mistake. My question is different, very loosely put, and very loosely put. The question is, what do queer theorists do when the state recognizes us as human before we do? And here, please feel free, to fill in the blank for the category human. So does our desire to be outlaws foreclose the possibility of our thinking about queers in terms of legal subjects? What other kinds of questions could be opened up by a theoretical shift toward thinking in terms of the human and the law? Questions about bodily integrity, privacy, health, citizenship, and some about legal and political immunity. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Back? Okay. So to begin, a story of sly defiance, appropriation, resistance, and queer maneuvering within the marriage matrix. The year before last, soon after the Supreme Court decisions on same-sex marriage, two close friends in San Francisco, a gay couple, decided to publicly acknowledge their committed relationship pointedly without getting legally married. They live separately by preference. One of them has an ex-partner that he still cares for while he dies of prostate cancer, who still lives with him a good portion of the year. They're sort of the quintessential heteronormative chosen family. My two friends bought a niche together in the San Francisco Columbarium, a fabulous temple of mortal remains that you should all visit sometime if you haven't, where their ashes will someday be interred. They said it was the only piece of real estate in San Francisco that they could afford. celebrate the purchase of their final resting place, they threw a party, Till Death Do Us Unite, where they served Day of the Dead cookies baked by their favorite bakery in the Mission. They passed out black tiaras for their guests emblazoned with the initials RIP. Being gay men of a certain age, they had a Judy Garland impersonator who regaled us all with show tunes. And we all went to visit to view the niche for our friend's cremains, already gaily decorated and awaiting its future inhabitants. One of them is an Audrey Hepburn devotee, and atop his empty urn is a bobblehead of Hepburn in her role as Holly Golightly from Breakfast at Tiffany's. His partner, a Disney queen, will have his ashes stowed in a vintage 1940s Pinocchio lunch pail. My friends exchanged vows both humorous and sincere, and we all took turns wishing them health and happiness until they faced what Peggy Lee has called that final disappointment. When it was my turn to toast, I said, you know, my partner Mimi and I have no plans to get married either, and I want to thank you for your solidarity in resisting the same-sex marriage juggernaut. A short while later, as the guests milled about the columbarium, munching on our skull-shaped sugar cookies, a 70-ish-year-old second-wave lesbian feminist came up to me and said, in all seriousness, I want to thank you for your comment. I mean, what the hell ever happened to feminism? What the hell ever happened to the idea that marriage is a form of property in another person? Good question. One that I'll get back to at the end of my remarks. So the program description for our panel today notes that, quote, in the aftermath of the June 2015 Supreme Court ruling, same-sex marriage is now the law of the land, and asks how this affects other queer movements for social justice. So, I was talking with Juana earlier. Juana was doing the B, I'm doing the T, other people were doing the L and the G. So in my role as T, one of the functions of transgender critique is, of course, to bring into visibility and to contest non-transgender assumptions, to de-center, cis-normativity. I hate that word, but there it is. That can characterize queer and straight worldviews alike. A trans critique of the panel description would focus on that word now. Same-sex marriage is now the law of the land, because trans people have already had same-sex marriage for decades, maybe since the 1960s, certainly since the 1970s. And this history teaches us some of the same lessons learned more recently by others from the history of non-transgender same-sex marriage. Just because we trans folk have been able to get gay married for a long time now hasn't meant that we can't get fired from our jobs, kicked out of our apartments, forcibly separated from our children, denied health care benefits, be institutionalized or incarcerated for walking while trans or beaten to death by a stranger or lover on the streets. Having same-sex marriage hasn't made us normal, and it hasn't made us free. Same-sex marriage and same-gender marriage for trans people historically has taken two forms. One form is when a couple legally recognized as heterosexual was granted a legal marriage. One partner changes legal sex, neither seek a divorce, and thereby create a situation where both partners are in a legally recognized marriage who are also legally recognized as having the same sex. The other form is when a marriage involving one or more transgender people, or when it involves one or more transgender persons, and both partners share the same social gender, gender identity, and gender expression, but legally occupy different sexes. For example, a conventionally feminine-appearing post-operative male-to-female transsexual lesbian born in a country where it's against the law to amend the gender markers on one's birth certificate marries her U.S. citizen cisgender girlfriend as a male because that's what she is in the eyes of the law, and she has the paperwork to prove it. Or alternatively, two transmasculine gay leather bears, one of whom is the birth dad of the child that they co-parent, who strategically decides that one of them will pursue legal sex change while the other will not, so that they can marry in order for the child to have access to the non-biological parent's employer-provided dependent health care benefits. These things actually happen, right? The actually existing reality of transgender same-sex marriage was, for some reason, not mobilized as a rhetorical resource in the campaign for cisgender. Nobody was saying, trans people have this, why can't we? Nor was transgender same-sex marriage strategically advanced as a practical option for two cisgender people of the same sex who really needed to be married for some reason, health benefits, immigration status, or what have you, even though they could have done this. Now here's how it would have worked. And granted, it would have worked better in some locations than others. Let's say there are two women who are in love with each other, but one's on a non-renewable visa that will expire within a year, while the other can't relocate internationally for some reason. They want to marry so that the non-citizen can stay in the country as the spouse of the citizen. One of the women goes to see her genderqueer nurse practitioner at the community health clinic and says words to the effect of, "I feel like a man trapped in a woman's body." The nurse practitioner says, "You are who you say you are." Diagnoses the patient with gender identity disorder, signs a form that enables the woman to change the F on her driver's license to an M, and then to apply for a new Social Security card and other forms of state-issued ID. Based on this medical and administrative documentation, the woman files for a court-ordered change of sex. The judge says, "You don't look like a man," and the woman says, "Well, I'm in early transition. I don't find testosterone to be medically necessary to support my identity, but I'm really clear about who I am and what I want to do." And the judge, who's seen it all before, the couple then goes to get a marriage license as husband and wife. They have a ceremony performed by a mail-order minister. They file a license, and voila, they are married. Legal marriage certificate now in hand, the person who had changed legal sex is shocked to realize she's not a man after all. She returns to the clinic, she returns to the judge, and legally and medically detransitioned, but she and her partner keep the marriage license because it is a contract lawfully entered into by two parties, both of whom wish for the contract to remain unbroken. These two women will have done what trans people who have wanted to be married routinely have done. That is, stay married as a same-sex couple even after one partner has changed sex, and changed sex strategically in order to marry a person of the same gender. And as complicated as this process sounds, is it really any more convoluted or disingenuous than any other green card marriage? The reason such scenarios remain more theoretical than actual is that marriage is an act that usually secures privilege in terms set by the dominant culture, and doing transgender, whether or not you are being transgender, is not an act that increases your privilege vis-a-vis state and society. The presence of transgender people in marriage actually renders visible the vulnerability that many kinds of non-normative people have to having whatever privileges they manage to acquire or to have conferred upon them stripped away from them because they are deemed to be the wrong kind of person to exercise or hold that particular privilege. One of the more notorious recent cases of the invalidation of the marriage of a trans person was Littleton v. Prang, 1999. Christine Lee Littleton was assigned male at birth in San Antonio, Texas in 1952. She started living socially as a woman at age 15, medically transitioned through surgery and hormones at age 18 in 1980, and had all of her identity documentation changed at that time. She met and married Jonathan Littleton in Kentucky in the early 1990s, after which the couple relocated to Texas. Upon Jonathan's untimely death a few years later, Christine sued his doctor, Mark Prang, for malpractice. After a protracted legal battle, the Fourth Federal Court of Appeals ruled that legal sex in Texas was determined by chromosomes, that sex was inalterable, that even though the Littleton marriage had been legally entered into in another state, it was invalid in Texas under Texas law, and that as a legal stranger to her supposed husband, Christine had no legal standing to sue Prang for malpractice, and that the case was thus dismissed. So, takeaway point, marriage secures nothing for you, even if you can get it, even if it looks heterosexual and gender normative, if you are not the right kind of person deemed eligible to have it. I just want to say one more thing before I close here. Looking on the website of that really strong advocate for transgender rights, the Human Rights Campaign, this resource page that was written before the Supreme Court decisions. It's called Transgender People and Marriage, the Importance of Legal Planning. And it's like, it is such a great document that says how little marriage actually gets you. It says, if it is critical that transgender people who are married become aware of their potential legal vulnerability and take steps to protect themselves as much as possible. As an initial matter, transgender people who are married should certainly act accordingly. At the same time, however, it is important to create a safety net in the event that the validity of your marriage is challenged. At a minimum, a transgender person who is married should have a last will for both spouses, financial and medical powers of attorney, a written personal relationship agreement including a detailed account of each spouse's rights and responsibilities with regard to finances, property, support, children, and any other issue that are important to the couple. The agreement should include an acknowledgement that the non-transgender partner is aware that his or her spouse is transgender to avoid any later claims of fraud or deception. Ideally, the couple should draft these documents with the assistance of an attorney and supplement them with any other legal planning documents that are appropriate to their specific circumstances. With those basic documents in place, transgender people who are married can at least ensure that the spouses can inherit each other's estates and retain control over their finances and medical decisions, even if the validity of the marriage is challenged. So the takeaway point for all of that for me is like, what does marriage get you? If you're the wrong kind of person to have a marriage, it gets you nothing. So what did happen to feminism? I have no idea. But I really wanted to tell that story. and it wanted to use it as a weak transition to the final point that I wanted to make. And since I only have 1 minute, I'm just going to summarize it quickly to say there was this forthcoming issue of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, about trans feminisms. And there's this really brilliant article in it called Transmasculine Insurgency in Chiapas, written about by a transmasculine person of mixed racial and ethnic and indigenous backgrounds who advances the idea of erotic sovereignty. Erotics drawn from Audre Lorde and sovereignty drawn from a lot of indigenous sovereignty arguments, to say that that it is important to recognize the spiritual dimensions of the inalienable erotic capacity that lies within us, which is always on the brink of theft by colonizing powers. Asserting transmasculinity for this author, Daniel Chavez, is thus an act of insurgency, a rebellion against this ongoing robbery. It is an assertion of the sense that our erotic power belongs to us alone. And that's the idea that I sort of wanted to end on, that however we occupy the marriage institution, whether we resist it, subvert it, use it somehow, that what's really important is that, basically that we use all of our social relationships to advance that sense of our own erotic sovereignty and those of people that we're in relationship with. Thank you.
Thank you again to all of the panelists. I told you we had a lot of ground to cover. And we're going to I'm going to hand over the microphone to the panelists. I'm going to hand over the floor to the audience. So I will sort of call on you, and I ask that you direct your questions to a particular member of the panel. It doesn't mean that only that person can answer it, of course, but I think things will move along a little quicker if you direct your questions appropriately. Yes.
Hi, thank you all. Thank you all for that, and I just direct mostly towards Chantal. I was at a talk recently by Daniel was saying where he was relating that he looked at a billboard of an Asian man serving in the U.S. military, or something happening in the U.S. military. He thought to himself, ethnic studies made that billboard. Like, this is what we have run. And Rod Ferguson and Jody Watt have been thinking about how multiculturalism has been sort of a condition of possibility for the institutionalization of ethnic studies. Mm-hmm. And your talk just made me think about what it means to say or to think about how gay marriage is the condition of possibility for the institutionalization of queer theory, and also how queer theory is a condition of possibility for the institutionalization of gay marriage. And I just wanted to hear maybe your
when it comes down, like, you know, the question of institutionalization of a discipline is always like something that kind of there's always a sense of mourning when it happens. Like, you know, it's like it's a kind of like almost like parallel to marriage. You know, you kind of like you battle, and then, you know, the celebration is also like followed by mourning. What I was more, and of course, you know, it's all, I'm a kind of the way I always unpack. But one of the questions that I was really struggling with is like it's a question about the state. When I say what happened when the states recognize you, like before you even like, you know, you had the time to do it. So it's not only a question of recognition, but it's also a question of like how can you sort of package, or how do you make yourself readable before the law? And yesterday, I was at Martin Melanson's panel, and he said something actually like, and I think he captured very well what I'm trying to do when he was talking about like queer and queerness is constitutive of normality as it messes with it, okay? And I think this is one of the challenges that we have, you know, when it comes like, you know, one of the dilemma for me is like, why I use the human, and I know it's very problematic because that's this kind of like, you know, imperial colonial, you know, enlightening construction, but I was really interested to think about what it is that, you know, it's not about conformity, but it's more like how do you make yourself like heard and seen? And so for me, this is what has been the battle. It's like, you know, at the same time, we don't want the law. We're creatures of the law in many ways, you know, and the way we sort of like kind of so even when you repudiate the law, you're still like engaging with it. And for me, like one of the things that I see queer theory has been sort of like a little bit more, it depends of the field, of course, but has been sort of like, we hold to the idea of the outlaws and the onlyness of queer. For us, it's like, it's very important because it does, but how can we do that at the same time, as well as also like make yourself like, so it's about like queer, for me it's about like making, how can you queer the human before the law? And that is a very difficult thing, right? And this is why like gay marriage, same-sex marriage has happened, you know, marriage equality was this. So it's a very difficult question. So is it a way to do it? It's not like, you know, but I'm like, because there's a certain, because the state only recognizes a certain conception of the human, right? And this is that human that gets like protected, okay? So, and to answer like sideways to your question, and then I'm gonna leave my colleagues with that, one of the things that I've been really thinking about a marriage equality decision is that it consolidates identity politics. Because it has like, the only way that the state's gonna hear you is your L, you see L, G, T. So there's a sense of like identity politics emerge very strongly in that decision. And for me, it's kind of like, it's actually weird in terms of a queer approach of that. So.
Sandy.
I have a question for the panel. I just want to pose the generation gap question. As a professor in Iowa, it's very difficult for me to convey this history that I think you, Lisa, I'm learning from her. But how do you convey that to a new generation of young people who may not be familiar with any of this kind of radical history? I mean, I teach it obviously, but I've had these conversations in cafes as well as in the classroom with a young generation of the alphabet soup, trying to figure out how to think radically when the language isn't as available to them. And how do we deal with the difference when young 18-year-old and 18-year-old students, I teach in Reddy College, how do we convey to them this long history of radicalism, of queer theory? And I agree entirely with Chandan, this idea that we were at a moment in queer theory where it was really opening up, and then it gets foreclosed in this language. And this is the only language they've been exposed to. Because I'm in Iowa where, you know, gay marriage was legalized early on, and they thought that was radical. So how do you translate that generationally across this divide?
I'm sorry, the mic just doesn't reach. You have to stand up.
Can't reach it.
It doesn't, yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm not the water over. Okay.
Electrocute us all.
Electrocute us. I mean, there's a larger question that you're asking about intergenerational transmission that is beyond the classroom, right? That really is a broad thing. And then you're asking the one about the classroom. So I have two comments, and one is that the young are not monolithically sort of, right? I mean, my classes are also full of genderqueers who correct me all the time. And so it's not the case that there's a kind of uniform, the radical elders and the clueless liberal young people. In fact, it's quite a diverse landscape out there. But in terms of the clueless liberals, right, the 18-year-olds, right, one of the things that's very important to me is that we not confine this conversation and education to queer classrooms and queer studies, right? So is Gayatri, are you still here?
No, she went.
Okay. Gayatri Gopinath and I co-teach a class, and it's an introductory class in American Studies, right? And it's called Intersections, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Global Context. And we teach the scholarship that I was just citing, we teach it in that course. So that it shouldn't be that only the students who self-select into a queer classroom or a gender and sexuality classroom learn about the history and politics of marriage. It's central to the project of imperialism and racial capitalism. It should come up in all of our but in a lot of places, including, say, my own department, which is a very radical department, it's ghettoized, right, to the gender and sexuality faculty teach that, and the others don't, right? So, and especially the queer color faculty teach that, right, particularly. So, aside from, thinking about how to in a classroom bring people along through education about marriage and politics, and is to do it in our introductory classes, in our American Studies, in our history survey, and our, to do it in all of our classes. This knowledge and these discussions should not be ghettoized to gender and sexuality contexts.
Anyone else on?
Hi, I just want to direct this at Juana, although it's open to everyone. I have a question about methodology, and I actually was thinking about your new toys, right? Which sounded very exciting. And I'm wondering how we get to thinking about kind of the effects of gay marriage, broadly considered, and in a way that moves beyond statistical knowledge, but which statistics can help point to, right? So I'm thinking about something like a phenomenology of gay marriage, right? And because I wonder, how can we talk about domestic violence within same-sex marriage, divorce, gay divorce. I speak as a budding gay divorcee. Practices of
Congratulations.
gay marriage counseling, gay divorce mediation, right? And gay marital rape, right? So how and also how kind of historical and cultural constructions of marriage kind of take up residence in our unconscious and play out in relationships with one another, even though we think we're so radical, right? And then, we get married and all of a sudden, these things are playing out, right? So anyway, that's my question.
Great question. I think it's interesting. Part of what you're talking about are all of the businesses that spring up around marriage, and so that's certainly something to think about. I have been thinking a lot about statistics. I mean, I think Black Lives Matter made us think when do we actually need statistics on the number of police shootings? Working at the university, when do we need statistics on the number of faculty of color or women of color? So I am learning to make data-driven arguments, even as I don't fully believe them, right? And so but it is, I think, important for us in certain ways to think about some of the policy implications for some of this stuff. Part of what I was trying to do in thinking about bisexuality and what happens if we think queer through perhaps a recentering of bisexuality is to think about things like sex work, to think about things like domestic violence, to think about, then all of a sudden abortion becomes a queer issue again, right? And so, and that might be a way that feminism comes back. You know, or immigration or any of these other things. But I think that specter of what, of the promise of marriage, right? The promise of marriage as a kind of security that will protect us from intimate violence, that will protect us from the state, that will, you know, keep us safe and warm in our old age, when in fact we will, you know, die alone and end up in a lunchbox. I think that it's really about kind of thinking through what it means to live with risk. And right now, I think we're in a moment where we want to step away from risk and instead perhaps really engage with what risk means on all of these deeper levels that are just kind of terrifying.
Hi everybody, I'm Carol Mason. I'm from the University of Kentucky, so I've been thinking about Kim Davis a lot. With that in mind, I really appreciated Dr. Reddy's remarks because I think that racialization of Kim Davis is absolute, right? She represents a radicalized whiteness. When people talk about her as a Rosa Parks of the new movement, right? And so you really gave me a lot to think of this through. My question is, how do we think about whiteness in this particular political situation? Is whiteness monolithic? Is whiteness the same as white supremacy? And also, well, I'd just like to hear you think more through your ideas with regard to Kim Davis, but especially as you were talking about epochs, I was trying to think about how do we characterize whiteness in this particular situation.
If you want the mic, you can sit over here. Here's some
The mic won't
I
travel.
don't do,
have
you
to go
do
to
whiteness, you do that. I'll think about it, but you start. I'll think about it.
I have to be honest, I didn't really hear the question.
No, oh, she said, how do you think about Kim Davis in relationship to a racialized critique of marriage?
Don't put your name in
I can say something.
It doesn't. This doesn't move. You have to come
there's a
together.
chair.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
Can you just hear me like this?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Please use the microphone for
You should probably stand.
okay.
by that.
It's a really good question. I wish I had more to say. I genuinely haven't thought about white racial formations in this argument in particular. What I will say about whiteness and Kim Davis is, you know, part of the argument that I'm trying to understand is the erasure of the meaning of rights, so that there is no counterpoint to the security state. And so if you think about Kim Davis, I mean, one, think about the radical difference between a image of civil rights where people are walking through Selma, Montgomery, where people are being bombed, where people are marching to get into university, to the new image of civil rights, which is somebody at a filing cabinet, right? And so, you know, what is being constituted, I think, is the affirmation of the banality of rights as whiteness. You know, and so the demand for whiteness as banality of rights is precisely what is going to has subverted even the smallest incremental transformation we had through African American freedom movement and Black civil rights litigation.
Thank you again. I don't necessarily know who the question is directed at per se, so take your pick. But I'm wondering what sort of leverage point thinking through a CRIP or disability studies politic offers
Kevin, do you want? I know
Kevin,
you've
did you want?
thought and written about that. Do you want? I don't think
I'll say something
Sure.
briefly about it. I think that's a really important question, and it's also in relation to disability and also in relation to the elderly, right? So there are certain situations where people have had to get divorced, right, in order to get in order to access rights, and I think that's part of the part of the analysis. It should be part of the analysis of the very differential way that marriage operates in relation to the state and state benefits, and that all the generalizations are always wrong, right? That there's then the specificities are crucial to the analysis. So I think that's a great point, and and analyzing how that is both in relation to the elderly, in relation to certain formations of caretaking. Others are supported through marital relations, and some are undermined through marital relations. I think that's a really crucial node for thinking through what the relation of the state to that institution. Thank you.
The other thing that I would add to that is I think it also makes us rethink what domestic intimacy can be for some people. And so, again, on all kinds of ways, both legally and emotionally, it really is an important change.
Thank you all for a great panel. I'm wondering if there's a way that we can not conflate queer theory with queer politics, and maybe begin to think about those kinds of quotidian queer cultural formations, particularly queer cultural formations on the ground, that don't really, are not really invested in state recognition of marriage. And it might be the black queer ethnographer in me, it might be those politics or those areas of inquiry that Chandan, you said have been forestalled because of this conversation around marriage. I know that this panel is about marriage, but I would just like to just put in the mix that there are all kinds of people living their lives in very radically queer ways, and they will not be recognized, and they really don't want that kind of recognition, because that kind of recognition may bring all kinds of violences to them. So I just wanted to maybe have you comment on those kinds of things and maybe kind of separate the queer theory from queer politics and the queer theory that's in sort of intellectual realms, and that's in some ways the queer politics that are also about recognition, and that there's queer ways of living that folks are doing.
Yeah.
I just want to say, in one of the decisions, they talked about queer marriage as forestalling the harm and humiliation that illegitimate children would suffer from having unmarried people. And so I think about your work on the children, right, in the ballroom, and what it means to be illegitimate, right? And so other ways to think about that harm and humiliation. I sort of renamed my two dogs Harm and Humiliation. But what it means to take up, what it means to live with harm and to live with humiliation as radical queer forms of kinship.
Thanks for that, Juana, because that was one of the things I was sort of referencing when I said that not all the students walk in the door seeking recognition or thinking that gay politics and marriage is what. I have tons of radical queer kids who have no truck with that and who have a whole different vision for what they're, and to have the conversation narrow to the ones who think about marriage is to perform all the exclusions that this whole panel was talking about.
Bringing those
Yeah, I did say something like that, so I'll say it very briefly. So one of the reasons why I wanted to stress that marriage is not one thing, and that it's a set of practices and forms of relationship and ways of reproducing that varies enormously in relation to different religious and different state and different ethnic and class formations. And so when people use the word marriage as a shorthand, as if it covered all these things, but it doesn't, right? So. And as a relic of settler colonialism, of course, the imposition of the Christian marriage and European modes of categorization continue to wipe out indigenous forms of both embodiment and sexual practice and reproduction, and so it means a complicated interrelation between the two. But it's part of that history of empire, right, and race why we can't use the term marriage as though it were a thing, and that we have to talk about different forms of kinship, and how the term marriage gets to attach to particular populations and particular privileges in certain states.
Maybe one last question?
Thanks. I also teach the Intro to LGBT Studies class, and 75% of my students are allies, and being an ally requires that homosexuality is biological, right? And if we're going to question that, then it's like, whoa, wait a second, you not at NYU then, eh?
Metaphorically, no.
It's like horrid, because you might suggest that being gender non-conforming is a good thing, not just something to be accepted, and then everyone's like uncomfortable, and right? Okay, so that's my context, and what I think that shows is that the concept, like, they were born that way, is really important to the success of marriage equality. And when I was thinking, so it's Lisa Duggan, so I was thinking, like...
Well, actually, Kevin, I think, maybe, might have something.
Anyone.
Born
marriage
that way.
is not just one thing, but I think that this legal argument depended upon biologizing sexuality in a way that goes across differences, totally universalizing on the human, actually. And I guess, I mean, maybe Chandan and Reddy, like, with the concept of racial, the racial liberalism, what happens to biology and difference in that's related then to creating this, like, this concept of one humanity, right, that all has this same sexuality with one of two things, heterosexual, homosexual. There's another connection there, right?
Yeah.
You can
Yeah. I mean, both of you, but
you should start.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just say, addressing the sort of teaching context, is that my experience has been that these kinds of narratives about sort of marriage and its relationship to a longer history as a kind of culmination of a kind of certain set of practices and activisms, that a lot of students actually see it as prescriptive and disciplinary. So that's the kind of response I get, and that they see it actually as enforcing a kind of born this way idea about gender that gets imposed upon them through what they learn in college and through sort of mainstream narratives about it. So they're often, and this goes back to the other question about how to teach it, like I find very undergrads, like 18-year-olds, really glad to hear somebody they imagine to be in some position of authority sort of take that apart, because it feels sort of less hegemonic and oppressive.
The history of eugenics is quite useful. Quite useful to the born that way problem. Yeah.
That's good. Yes, on eugenics. And then, and I think there's a couple things to say, and I'll be quick with the first, which is I think one of the things that one has to do in these courses is really, you're absolutely right that sexuality has been one way in which the human has been conceived and has been differentially produced. And I think we have to just follow Rod Ferguson here, right? Rod Ferguson's intervention in Aberrations in Black is to say that, in fact, blackness has been conceived as non-heterosexual difference, right? From single motherhood to all kinds of forms of the history of both enslavement and as well as in Jim Crow and so forth. So I think one of them is to get away from this parallelism that you're doing, and really think of it that way. And then secondly, I want to interrupt for a moment, and I think this is the question about students, a conversation that there's a generational difference in activism, because again, I think it's construing white racial formation as the way that we're understanding queerness. We are in a moment in which 19 and 18-year-olds have seized the streets and have talked about a critique of civil rights as Black trans folk, as they call themselves cisgender when they've been living in places where no one has ever said that before, right? And they've been making these alliances instantaneously, and they know something of these histories, And so I think that if your students come in and they don't know this, you need to teach them a history of why they don't know this moment, right? And not, whether or not they're of a generation that knew a queer past. Thanks a lot for